begin to do that, we see things very differently. And then we can sit down and we can strategize, having done that work, right, how we are going to collectively try to change the systemic structures that reinforce that notion. But as long as we aren't questioning our own lens, we're going to be like that guy who emailed me who doesn't realize that his lens set him up. His lens lied to him. His lens made him believe a myth about his country that wasn't sustainable. And now he didn't know how to deal with it. We better learn to deal with it, because if we don't, we're going to get to that day in 2030, 2035, 2040, whatever it is. And if we haven't done something to address racial inequity then, I want you to really ask yourself, how do we remain a productive society if we get to that day and the one half of the nation that are people of color continue as they do now to have twice the rate of unemployment, 3 times the rate of poverty, 9 years less life expectancy on average, double the rate of infant mortality, double the rate of low birth weight children born to moms in that community as opposed to the white community, 1/20th the net worth of the white community? How in the world do we maintain a productive society for anyone, including white children and white families, if we get to that day and those numbers haven't changed? I would submit to you that we will not remain a healthy or productive place for anyone, so we had best get busy now. Because if we don't, our children and our grandchildren are going to be back in these rooms in 20 or 30 or 50 years, having these same conversations, only the risk at that point is going to be far greater, and the odds of success in creating multiracial democracy will be far more remote, and we will collectively be in a much worse and much more painful place than we are currently. Thank you for being here. And, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So, thank you so much for being here. I went a few minutes longer than I wanted to, but that's sort of the way it goes. Anyway, if you have to leave, I totally understand. I appreciate you coming. If you could just do me one big favor, if you do leave, if you could leave with the least amount of volume so that we can move right into the Q&A. And for folks who want to stick around a few minutes, do about 20 to 30 minutes of those. We have a microphone right here. So if you raise your hand, we can get the microphone to you so you can ask a question, and we'll do as many of those as we can in the little bit of time that we have left. And then we'll go out and I'll be happy to sign some books, sell some books, whatever the case might be. So if you can leave as quietly as possible, thank you so much. And if you have a question, raise your hand so we can get a microphone to you. Thank you. Is it on? Okay. I can't hear you. I don't know if it's on or not. Is it? Okay, there we go.
Really complicated topic, and I think you can see by the way the room is clearing that Chester County and the area is really kind of a bubble.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, in terms of people being exposed, people who are different, people with different backgrounds, different color.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know what you think would be some good strategies for, because I teach English at the university. I wanted to know what you think would be some good strategies for starting to break this down on a daily basis with our students, for faculty.
Right.
Or for students trying to break it down with each other, have this conversation. Because I think that, you know, a lot of people felt like they probably just got a good dose of violence, you know.
Yeah.
They heard the talk and then they go back to their regular lives.
Yeah, yeah.
For those of us who are interested in doing the hard work, what do you suggest?
Well, I think that the first step in staying in the work, beyond the attending the lecture or the writing of a paper for a class and like a one-shot deal or whatever, is only when we begin to really sense our personal stake in this matter, and that goes for me too, do we really commit to the long-term struggle and the long-term hard work that has to be done. I think what we do a lot of times is we avoid that, and we have different reasons for avoiding it. Sometimes it's just too close to home and too personal and we just don't want to go there. Other times We have folks who, like myself, come from, I mean, I come out of a radical left political tradition where I think there's a lot of philosophical and ideological predisposition to not deal with the personal piece because we're so committed to the systemic analysis about racism, which I think is an important one, certainly, to have. But sometimes we let that systemic analysis become so overriding that we can't deal with the personal piece at all because we think that that's like somehow getting away from the systemic, not realizing that systems are perpetuated by real people, right? Systems and institutions don't happen on their own. They are perpetuated by actual damaged human beings who, by virtue of not having really ever had to confront our role in these institutions, can somehow put it off as some abstract notion. It's not abstract. It's very real. It's very concrete. Only when I sat down to really think about my personal role in the maintenance of the system of oppression and my potential role in rebelling against it, did I actually commit to the long term and stop getting burned out? Because what happens until you do that piece, you get burned out really easily because you go to the barricades for like 5 years and you do the work and you fight and you argue and then things don't change and you're like, oh my God, this is really hard, you know. And folk of color, of course, already knew it was hard. It's been intergenerationally difficult, but they keep fighting it because they have no choice. Their lives depend on it, both individually and collectively. And I think until we realize that to some extent our lives, whether literal or metaphorical, depend on it, whether in a literal physical sense or just a spiritual or emotional or whatever sense, affective sense, also depend on it, do we stay in the work? How might we do that? Well, one of the ways that we can get to that place is I think that instructors, whether they are daily classroom instructors or whether it's an outside speaker like myself, we have to be willing to share some of our personal story if we expect other people to come to that place with us. If we expect them to get to that personal place, we've got to go there. One of the reasons I wrote White Like Me, which is, you know, the first book I did, which is a memoir and I've now redone in a third edition, is because I thought that was the most important thing I could share. It wasn't the data and the statistics, as valuable as that stuff can be. It was really the personal connection, because if I want other people to be honest about privilege, if I want other people to be honest about their internalized biases that we've all sort of picked up to one degree or another from the culture, from our parents, from the media, from peers, whatever it might be, I can't ask you to do that if I'm not willing to do that, because nobody wants to go first. You're not going to put your stuff in the street, as we say in the South, if I'm not going to put my stuff in the street. But if I'm willing to go first and say, look, I got conditioned around this. My lens was distorted and still is, on occasion, distorted because of my racial identity. Now, how about you? Well, you're going to be more likely to be willing to share that. So I think in the classroom, it means that instructors need to be willing to go to that place that we are so encouraged not to go, which is to drop the veil of objectivity that surrounds the academy. This idea that somehow instructors are these separate and apart beings, and we just dispense knowledge, whether it's me up here at the podium or you in a classroom, and other people are supposed to soak it in what Paulo Freire called the banking model of education. This idea, right, that I'm just going to dispense knowledge, and then I'm going to ask for a withdrawal from the bank of your brain when it's time for a test. That's a very passive way to learn, and it doesn't create engaged, active citizens in the global sense of citizenship. And so we've got to encourage that kind of critical engagement, but it's very rare that people will do it if we're not willing to go to that place. If we decide we're going to maintain this aloof, objective air about us, then if I'm a student in the classroom, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to say, God, I don't think I can really talk about my privilege because I'm afraid you might like grade me down because of that. If I acknowledge I'm privileged, if I acknowledge my own biases, it's going to be a mark against me, and is that going to be on the test? And I just need to know what's on the test, and I don't want to, you know. But if you're willing to say, hey, look, this is how I got twisted by this conversation, and I'm willing to own that. How about y'all? What do you think? Right, then we can have real conversations. It's not going to be easy. There's still going to be some, you know, timidity about it and some concern. But I think that's the way that we keep our head in it, right, is by sharing our personal stuff and encouraging other people to come to that place with us as we talk about it as a real personal and systemic issue. The reason that we have this personal damage is because of the way the system has twisted us. So it's not about taking an interpersonal analysis as opposed to a systemic analysis. It's about showing the interrelationship between those two things and how our conditioning around race, our privileges around race or gender or sexuality or whatever it is, all stem from this material basis, this systemic basis, but then it works a number on our own understanding, and it makes us less likely to act, even when we know there's something wrong, because at some level, we don't see ourselves as having been damaged. I think when white folks come to see that we are the collateral damage of a system of racial oppression. We're not the targets, but we are the collateral damage of it because it diminishes our capacity for solidarity as human beings, and it diminishes who we are, and it takes from us certain abilities and capacities, even the ability or capacity to have a conversation with people of color without getting nervous. Like, that's a harm of racism to white folks. When we get nervous about talking about race, what the hell? Like, why are you afraid of that? It's just like two people sitting across a table having coffee, and you starting to sweat, and your heart is beating heavy. You're, oh my God, I'm going to say the wrong thing. Man, what? You're like a competent person. You can like carry on a conversation about all kinds of stuff, and then this comes up, and you're like, blah, blah, blah. You know, that's heavy damage, you know? And if we understand that, then I think we will come back to that place again and again and again, even when we screw up, which we will, and we'll keep trying, you know. But I think we have to model that behavior for students, is we've got to really talk about some of that personal stuff if we're going to get to that place. Other questions? I don't know who's got the mic, so I don't know who to call on, but okay. Whoever you want to get it to, I'm going to let you choose. Okay, you got one? Cool, okay. Hi. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. No. Let's. Okay. Well, here's the thing, and I don't disagree with your assessment as a potential problem. I will tell you this. Having been at this for a while and having tried a lot of different approaches to reach people with the content, the core content of what I talked about, which I think was pretty clear in terms of what I was saying at the core content about privilege and inequality and the harm and the damage that it brings, in spite of the humor that I used to make that point. I can assure you that as many people as may have left at the end of the speech, and maybe because of the humor they don't get the complete gravity of it. I don't know that that's necessarily true, but maybe for some it is true. I can assure you that if I had made the same core content points without the humor, they would have left 30 minutes into the talk and wouldn't have stayed at all. And that's unfortunate, but it's real. And so I have to deal with, just like any of us, what is real. I can't deal with people where I want them to be. I have to deal with people where they are. And I know that where people are is that this is some really heavy stuff that for most people they have never heard. Or if they've heard it, they've had the luxury of ignoring it because maybe the people who said it were people of color, and so they, as white folks, didn't have to listen, right? Which is about privilege. So here I am. I have this privilege of being able to stand up and talk for an hour, and for the most part, people stick around. I mean, some people left, and I don't necessarily read that as anger or hostility. They might just have a test to study for. I mean, people leave for all kinds of reasons. But what I do know is that if the humor allows, and I can't prove that it does, but having done this for 16 years, I can tell you I know the feeling that audiences give back, and I can read the energy and the body language of people relatively well to know that when I didn't use the humor to make the same points, I don't think the points were made as effectively because it was, for many people, so difficult to take in these repeated body blows about privilege and inequality and injustice that for a lot of people, they just shut down. Now, I can be pissed about that, and I can say, damn it, you ought to be able to hear this raw and unfiltered and without any humor, and, that'd be great. I also know that that's not real. So the humor is not just a device. It is actually my natural way of addressing issues because I think it is a valuable tool. it is possible, and I totally respect if for you it doesn't work because you think it was a little over the line of what level of humor. I totally understand and I respect that. And it's possible. It's possible that you can go up to that line and maybe do a little too much of it, and it's always a give and take. It's always sort of it's like, you do a little, and then as soon as you do the hard piece, you do the funny piece, and you bring it back to the hard piece so people don't think it's just funny, and then it's always this dance. And for different people, it's going to work different ways. But I can honestly say to you that I think that the constructive use of humor and the constructive use of ridicule of one's adversaries done in a humorous way is a strategy for making the point. And I don't think anyone who was here could say that because of the humor, they didn't get the point that I was condemning racism and privilege and inequality. I mean, I think you'd have to be extraordinarily not paying attention to not have gotten that, and I don't think people who left are in that space. I think that it is an important tool as a first step for a lot of people. And then what has to happen next, right, is that the conversation has to be furthered on the campus, maybe with the use of humor, maybe not with the use of humor, but if it allows people to come to the table, and I don't know that it will, but from past experience, I'll tell you that I think it does, and I think I certainly have enough experience seeing it work that I think it will work and help, that people will then come to the table and be prepared to engage in a much more, maybe not so humorous, not so lighthearted, just real hardcore stuff, and I can't be the one. No outside speaker, I think, should be, me or anyone else, should be the one to come into a space like this and necessarily give the marching orders, which is the other piece of your point that I think is very important. Where it seemed like what I'm hearing you say is it's also important for for people to know what they're supposed to do next and what is that next step. And I agree with you, but I think that piece ultimately has to be decided upon by the people in the space after I leave town, because if I give you marching orders and advice, like here's the PowerPoint 1 through 10, by God, go do these things, a couple things are true. Number one, I'm going to be out of here tomorrow, and if my advice really sucks, I'm not going to pay the price for the bad advice that I give. Other people will. And so I think my advice would be the same as what I think people who were a little older in the early phase of the civil rights struggle, the student aspect of the struggle, what they did. I mean, what did Ella Baker do? Ella Baker did not tell young people what to do in order to break the back of apartheid in the South. She, an older veteran of the movement, got young people together at Shaw University in Raleigh and had them sit down at the formation of SNCC as an organization and had them figure out what they were going to do. And that was a genius move because on the one hand, she didn't know what they were going to come up with. These were 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old young people, and she'd been in the work for 2 decades, but she had enough confidence that she said, you know what, I know that you have the intelligence, the ability, the foresight, the energy, the innovative capacity to be able to sit down in these church basements for like 8 hours at a time with no air conditioning, and by the time y'all come out, you will have strategies for making moves on this system and changing it. And these young people did that. They did it without other folks. So a lot of times I think we make the mistake in this country of deferring to the so-called experts who are from the outside or who are older, have been at it a long time, when in fact, y'all have got the ability to figure out how to deal with the climate issues that I know have been studied on this campus. I'm sure that folks have ideas about how to deal with that. All my job, I think, is to come in, maybe offer an analysis for understanding that larger framework, right? Offering trying to maybe reorient the lens a little bit so that we can begin to hear one another. And then the folks in this space have the capacity to say, given all of that, here are the things we need to be thinking about. And if you don't have those answers now, which I wouldn't expect people to have, if you sit down and really hammer that out, I believe that you can come to that. And I think that's what the history of this movement against racism, against injustice generally, has always proven, is that it's the innovative ideas of the people in the community working together and being willing to really suffer it out and hammer it out and sweat it out with each other who have always made the difference. If I can come in and maybe create the capacity to hear that on the part of people, that's my role. But that's not the long-term important role. That's like an orienting role for people, and hopefully it'll help. But, I do recognize that humor is a dangerous tool if not used correctly. I know it can be problematic, and I definitely do not recommend that people do it if they aren't, pretty good at it. I mean, everybody thinks they're like, you know what I'm saying? I mean, like people always think they're really funny, and a lot of times they're not. And so, it's not open mic night, every time we stand up. So I think that humor can be a problem, and I think we've learned that. I mean, Dave Chappelle learned that's one of the reasons he stopped his show, was because he realized that the way he was using humor to break down racism and white supremacy, which I actually thought was quite brilliant of him. But what he came to recognize, you know, and walk away therefore from a $50 million contract was that other folks didn't get the joke. And because they didn't get the joke, he couldn't take the risk. But that's also because his humor was, it was really heavy and ironic and really deep, and you sort of had to be in the conversation to get what he was getting at. And most people weren't in the conversation. And what I try to do, and what, not just me, there are other folks who do the work as well, try to do is make it, the conversation is about race. We're going to use humor very directly as we talk about it. We're not going to try to be too slick, which is what I guess maybe he decided his own humor was, which is why he got concerned and walked away. So everybody's got to use their own style, and I know for some people, humor's part of that, and for other people, it's not. I hope people know, though, that my use of it and my decision to deploy it is both, A, it's natural for me, but it's also, I think, strategically valuable to be able to hear some of these really difficult truths. But I realize that for not everybody will it work, so I do apologize if for anyone it does not work. I am sorry for that. But I mean, I'm not going to apologize for what I do, but I will apologize for the fact that it will miss the mark for some people, you know, which I realize is true. But that's true no matter what style I bring. I mean, I could just get up here and just yell at folks for an hour, and that would really miss the mark with more. I'm pretty confident. So, you know, yeah. Who else has the mic? Anybody have it already, or do we just need to run it to somebody? Oh, you've got it back there? Great. Go ahead. Yeah. Well, I think that the most important thing I can add to what you just said is that it can't be just for you to deal with that. You know, that's the problem, is that we've let that problem be your problem, and it's not your problem. You know, that's the great conceit that non-Muslim peoples in the West have, and even progressive, you know, non-Muslim peoples have sometimes adopted, which is this notion that it's for you to deal with, and maybe we'll be behind you, cheering you as you challenge people's ignorance about these issues, but you know, we have to take some of that weight off of you, because just like for white folks, we have to take some of that weight off of people of color. Men have to take some of that weight off of women, straight folks off of LGBT folks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because now it's not that we can do the work for the marginalized. That's a dangerous thing. It's not, you know, it's not about, oh, supplanting. I mean, obviously, look, in the fight against Islamophobia, Muslim peoples have to be leading that fight because they have the most to lose or gain, whether it's done right or wrong. So we need to follow the lead of Muslim peoples, but we've got to show up. And I think what we haven't done, you know, is whether it's you, your daughter, or anyone else who's having to answer these asinine questions over and over and over and over again in these challenges, you know, about how do you feel about this and how do you feel about that, it's really incumbent upon us to begin asking the people who are doing that, you know, how do you feel about every time that someone like yourself gets asked that question? For those people who were sitting and standing by, maybe not the ones who were challenging you or being, you know, deliberately ridiculous to you or other Muslim peoples, it's like, how do you feel about the fact that some other white Christian or white Jewish person or white non-Muslim asked this ridiculous question to your daughter, and their answer is going to be, well, I didn't do it. Okay, fine, but how do you feel about it? Because somebody just like you did, you know, when are you going to show up and challenge it? It's really about whether we're going to act in solidarity. And And I don't think we've done nearly enough of that. You know, it's really interesting how after 9/11, I was watching all this commemorative footage, as I'm sure many of us were, and it was fascinating. As the first hour or so of the footage was transpiring, and it was, I think, before the second tower fell, maybe even before the North Tower fell. It was really interesting. It was Tom Brokaw and Katie Couric. It was their broadcast that I was listening to. And either Brokaw or Katie Couric won. This is all within what, like 100 minutes? I mean, the whole thing is over in 102 minutes, right, or something like that. So within an hour and a half, they were already announcing that, for instance, that Yasser Arafat and the PLO had issued a condemnation of the action. Now, the reason I found this interesting was that, of course, they really didn't need to do that. They had nothing to do with it, so why would they feel the need to issue a condemnation? I mean, you know, of course, the answer to that question is because we were going to demand it. You know, we wanted to make sure that every organization fighting for the freedom and liberation of Muslim peoples anywhere on earth was going to condemn, you know, what had happened. And so here's Yasser Arafat, you know, issuing a condemnation, and the PLO issuing, and Fatah issuing a condemnation. And what was interesting, in the days after 9/11, do we not recall how the line that was being heard from all quarters in this country was, when are the moderate Muslims going to condemn this act? Well, the PLO, which, you know, in American eyes had never been a moderate organization, always been viewed and listed as a terrorist organization, hell, they were condemning it within the first hour. So what more do you want? Like, folks are condemning it left and right, and when are the moderates going to condemn it? Well, they did it like 3 days ago. Where were you? You know, but we're demanding this in a way that we don't. When Christian peoples do terrorist acts, when Jewish folks commit terrorist acts, when anyone who is not Muslim commit terrorist acts, you know. So until we are prepared to stand and demand the same kind of accountability, if only to be ironic, if only to make the point. Like, I don't think that if you're a Christian, you have to apologize the next time some lunatic who claims to be a Christian blows up an abortion clinic. I don't really think it's your fault, but I'm damn sure going to ask you for an apology just to make a point. Right? And if I'm not prepared to ask you and demand an apology every time that happens, every time someone who claims to be a Christian kills their whole family or wipes out a school or blows up a building, I'm going to go church to church to church to church and demand apologies from them just to make a point, even though I really don't think they're to blame. That's solidarity. That's about saying, yeah, you think that's crazy, you think that's asinine, you think that's unfair? Exactly. That's the point, and it's equally unfair here. But until we're prepared to do that, until we're prepared to step out and risk what we know can be the backlash from that, then you're going to end up having to carry that whole weight, and that's too heavy a weight for you to have to carry. It shouldn't be your responsibility. So for you, I think, you know, you obviously have to do what you're comfortable in any given moment doing, trying to educate people. And that has a lot to do with how you perceive your safety in that moment. You know, I don't recommend that you try to necessarily challenge, depending on the situation. You've got to feel it out, right? You've got to determine in a given situation, is it safe for me to really challenge stupidity right now? And if the answer is it's not, you have to protect yourself, and you have to take care of that daughter, and you have to be careful because they're crazy people who are not going, you know, it's like, I'm very careful. I don't get in arguments just every time they came up about race. Like, if I'm in somebody else's taxi cab, I don't get in an argument about race because I'm in their car and they could drop me anywhere and they could lock the door so I can't get out. And so I pick my moments, you know, based on my own understanding of safety. And you've got to do the same thing, to live to fight another day. But part of it also, for people who are the targets of oppression, is my advice would be, those are those moments when you need to identify your quote-unquote allies, those who claim to be your allies, those who claim to be your friends who are not Muslim and don't have to speak out. That's when you need to go to them and tap them on the shoulder and say, you know how you asked me one time how you can help me? Okay, now's the time. This is what I need you to do. And that's how you're going to determine whether that ally is real or not. And that's the same thing for folk of color. Like, when you are fighting these battles on a college campus or in a community, and, you know, that's the time when you go to those white folks who have said, oh, I'm about something, I'm an ally, and you go, right now is when I need you. I need you to go into that room and to say something in addition to what I'm saying. I need you to back me up. And that's how you're going to find out whether people are for real or whether they're not about allyship. But that's really for the rest of us to begin to take some of that on, so that doesn't become this all-encompassing, crushing burden that you alone have to carry, because that's not fair for you to have to do that. Other questions? We're going to take one more, and then I'm going to go out there and do books, I guess. So whoever's got a mic, I don't know where it is or what happened. There we go. Okay, good.
Hi. Thank you so much, first of all.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I think leading by example is really important. I think that becomes a more effective way of cajoling than direct cajoling, right? I mean, I can make somebody, I'll give you an example. A lot of times I speak at schools where I'll do trainings for like residence hall advisors, right? And one of the things I always tell Res Life folks, or student government folks, or you know, presidents of fraternities or sororities, or just whatever, you know, student leaders of whatever type. All of those are examples of student leaders. Is, you know, if they care about something, if they know that something is important, the only way that others are going to see and believe that it's important, and they may not anyway, but the only way they're going to, is if they see those leaders putting themselves in those spaces to have those uncomfortable conversations, right? So I always tell Res Life people, if you're an RA and, you know, you go through the motions, right? So you put the poster up that says so-and-so's coming to give a speech, or the so-and-so organization is having a forum on blah, blah, blah. Because that's what you're supposed to do. That's like the least that anybody can do, and that's the least most people, it's the most a lot of times we do. So we put up the signs, and it announces the meeting, or it announces the forum, but then we don't go to them. Now, I know not everybody can go to everything. I mean, college is a busy time. Folks got a lot of stuff. Some of y'all have jobs that you got to, you know, I know you can't go to everything. But if you never go, right, to those events, if you never show up and put yourself in that uncomfortable space, then the residents on your floor, let's say of the residence hall, who you're telling, oh yeah, you should go to that, really, you should go to that. See, I put the poster up, you should go to that. After a while, they're going to look and go, yeah, but you don't really mean that, right, because you never go. Same thing with faculty. Like I always tell, I have this long-standing policy. I know there are a lot of schools that, sometimes I didn't know this happened, but I learned that a few years ago, like students would come up to me after a talk and they would, or no, sometimes before the talk, and they would say, oh, my professor told me to come. Could you sign this piece of paper, you know, that says I was here and, you know, because I got to get credit or whatever. And I would say, well, where's your professor? Oh, they're not here. Well, then I'm not signing your paper. Because if a professor is going to tell you to come to an event because it's really important and they're not going to come, I think the message that you send is that it isn't really that important. And again, I know faculty sometimes have other things that come up. They got families potentially, but then don't expect your students to come. And definitely don't expect me to sign a piece of paper that says they were there, right? So at some point you have to, leading by example, like if you're and I know there's sometimes like if you're a student government leader or the head of a fraternity or a sorority, you know, it may not be your thing. Like I realize not everybody wakes up every day thinking about this kind of stuff the way that some of us do. That's fine. But if you're a leader, right? The difference between a leader and everybody else, at least ostensibly, is that sometimes you do stuff you don't want to do because being a leader means you're supposed to do it. Like, it's just part of the gig, you know? So I'm sure that, like, people that lead foundations or lead, or people who are run for political office, yeah, I mean, they don't like doing some of this stuff. I'm sure they don't like having to go out and raise all that money and deal with some of the people they got to deal with, but they got to do it because that's what differentiates leaders from everybody else. So if I am in a leadership role, and maybe, you know what, I'm not that animated over these issues of race and privilege and inequality, but if I want to be a leader, and I know there are people on my campus who care about the stuff, I know that there are, and I know that there are people who are concerned, and I know there's a climate survey that says we have issues, right? Then as a leader, I have to be willing to put myself in that space at least a few times during the course of the academic year, just to demonstrate that, you know what, I'm willing to go and maybe be uncomfortable, and I hope y'all will come to a meeting as well, and maybe y'all will come to a forum, and you'll come to one of these dialogue sessions, or you'll get involved in thinking about this. And it might just be that by doing that, even though it'd be nice to also do more active pressuring and cajoling if you're really into it, but just as a leader, stepping out of your comfort zone, doing some stuff that you're not necessarily, you know, super animated about, but because you realize it's important to somebody else. And that's what we do when we care about people. And if we're going to be a leader, part of being a leader is demonstrating that level of concern and respect for where other people are. And so I think that's maybe the most important thing, because I really do think most people who don't get involved in these kinds of things, they don't get involved for two reasons. Number one is that they don't see themselves or other people like them reflected in the work. So if I'm a white man, for instance, and I don't see a lot of other white men who are getting involved in, you know, the struggle against racism or sexism, I might, even if I believe in that struggle, I might sort of stay on the sidelines just because I'm Maybe I think it's not my place. Maybe I'm afraid I'm going to do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing. Maybe I'm worried about being ostracized by other white men, which is a real fear. I mean, it's that fear that James Baldwin talked about with regard to white folks, being the fear of being turned away from the welcome table of white society. That fear is real. It's the fear of like being sort of cut off from some of our friends and family, and out. So I get it. So that's number one, the thing that intimidates us. And then the second thing is that we really don't think we can make much of a difference. We have, I think the whole culture has this, which is really odd and twisted when you think about it, given the relative strength and power and wealth and privilege of Americans generally, U.S. Americans generally. We have this learned helplessness around change, and it's always been this way. I think we sometimes think it's a new thing. So you'll hear young people, and this was true 25 years ago when I was starting college, and I think it's true now. You always hear people say, oh, this is the most apathetic campus in America. Well, okay, somebody's lying to me, because everybody tells me that they are the most apathetic campus in America. They can't all be right, but they all think they're right, and they all think that apathy is new. Like they really believe, and they think like you can't change things, and it's not like the 60s when everybody was up in arms and changed. Everybody who thinks the 60s were like that weren't there, because that's not actually the way campuses were in the 60s. That's the idyllic, sort of mythologized image that we have, that everybody on college campuses in the 60s was a radical. Actually, in 1968, Gallup did a poll. The two most popular people on American college campuses among college students were actually Richard Nixon and John Wayne, right? So they were not SDS members. It was not Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, and it was not Mark Rudd, and it was not Tom Hayden, and it was not Stokely Carmichael. It was not these were not activists and radicals. Most people weren't active then either. But what folks knew then, at least some knew, and I guess maybe we have forgotten now, and maybe it's because our society is so much more fast-paced. There's so many things to distract us now that, back in those days, you had 3 networks, right, on television, and there was no cable. It was ABC, NBC, CBS, and that was like it. And then, PBS, I guess, a little later in the day. And all. I mean, so, it's like I said, in 1990, we went to bed early. You can imagine in 1960, right? I mean, it was a much slower-paced society, far fewer distractions. So maybe people thought that they had a direct line to change, that now we feel like there's so many things being thrown at us that how do you even hear a voice of change above the din of all this other stuff? And that makes sense. Like, I understand that that's got to be, because you figure like, well, you could blog about something or you could write about something, and who would even hear it? Because, all your friends got 30 million updates from all their other Facebook friends. They might not even see your update that you posted something really important, so you just sort of throw your hands up. But what I think we've got to get back to is a realization that whenever change has happened, including in the 60s. I mean, that change that happened was the result of the actions of a very small, numerically speaking, minority of students, whether of color or white. Most of the black students on historically black college campuses were not active in the movement. Most white students, even on traditionally very left campuses and progressive campuses, were not active. In fact, they often condemned those who were. And those students had the very same doubts about their ability to be effective, but they took the chance. They took the risk. And I don't know whether it's, a generational thing or what it is, or whether it's the influence of mass media, or whether it's the fact that, we all know that now you graduate with far more debt than people used to graduate with. So you're all, you sort of get into that gerbil in the wheel thing where it's like, well, I want to make a difference, but I've got to pay off this ridiculous amount of debt. And that's true. I mean, that's real hard stuff. And it's a really interesting way that the society has developed the capacity to maintain injustice by making it so hard for people to envision making justice real, by making the life so difficult. Like, if you choose to go down that path, you're going to struggle, and you're not going to, so we got to make some real changes systemically about that. We've got to really talk about, as some schools have done, significant loan forgiveness for people that go into social justice-oriented careers, who go into that kind of work, And I mean, there's a lot of talk about that, and there are institutions that have done it, but we've got to really begin to think about institutionalizing that. But in the meantime, I think the most motivating thing for me, I will tell you, and the thing that made me stop giving up or getting burned out, because like anyone, you get burned out. But what made me stop doing that was learning that history of those who had come before me who had frankly risked a whole hell of a lot more than I was risking. You know, yeah, there are a lot of people who do not like me, and they let me know that in a lot of different ways. But the danger that I'm in, the risk that I run doing the work that I do is nothing compared to the risk that people of color and white allies in the earlier stages of this movement endured. And if they could do that, and if they could commit their lives to that, then me, in this much more, relatively speaking, privileged space, you know, able to do this work professionally and over a pretty long period of time, I have no right to sort of say, gosh, it's so hard, you know, I think I'm getting too tired. I mean, the reality is we are on this planet for a ridiculously small amount of time. In the larger scheme of things, billions of years of this universe, and we are here for maybe 80 on average, maybe 100 if we're really lucky, or we could die tomorrow. And if that is the case, and it is, then we have to fundamentally make a decision. And I cannot think of a better time to have this discussion with oneself than while you are in college, where you have the relatively privileged ability to sort of step back from some of the vagaries of everyday life. I know that's not true for all, because some people are having to support families while they're in school and send money back to families. But for most of us, you know, this is a relatively privileged time, and it's a relatively easy time compared to what's coming, which is going to be harder when you got mortgages to pay and all those bills and all that stuff. In this period right now, it's a really good time to engage that conversation about how we're going to justify our time on this earth, how we are going to justify the oxygen that we stole from other beings, human and otherwise, who could have made better use of it potentially. Because we all could have been born some other creature. We could have been born a sloth, we could have been born a tadpole, we could have been born a muskrat or something. We were born humans at this particular moment in history, where there's so much opportunity relative to, I guess, the larger arc of history. And so we have to really ask ourselves why. And whether you have answers to that question that are spiritual in nature and theological in nature and are grounded in a faith system, or whether you have answers that are more naturalistic and materialistic and not necessarily rooted in a faith system, but in a larger natural sort of assessment. Either way, you still have to have the same conversation. Why are you here, and what are you going to do to make your time worthwhile? And I think once you begin to engage that conversation, you begin to realize, at least I did, and maybe it's just me, and this won't mean anything to anyone else, but for me, I sat with this for years, and I came to the conclusion that the only thing that really differentiated us as humans from any other species on the planet, it wasn't that we were smarter, because we might, in fact, be considerably less intelligent than many species, in the sense that no other species poisons its own land base. No other species builds weapons that are capable of destroying all human life. So that's not real bright. We may be really actually considerably non-cerebral compared to others who actually protect their own land base and don't poison it. It's not because we're the only altruistic species. Other species have been seen acting in altruistic ways vis-a-vis one another, and entirely different species from themselves. So the only thing that I was left with at the end of that sort of dialogue was that the only thing that really makes us truly different, that I can prove, because you could argue, I guess, some spiritual basis of some relationship to a God figure, but since I can't prove that, I'm leaving that to the side for a minute. The one thing that I can prove is that we are, apparently, from all evidence that I can see, the only species that has ever organized collectively for liberation of oneself or others. I mean, even like the animal rights movement had to be started by people, right? And that's not like a critique of animals, non-human animals. I don't mean it to be like anthropocentric and critical. I'm just saying, like, even humans had to do that because the mink could not do it alone. So, and other animals. So what that means is that we have this capacity, if we choose to use it, for this really unique thing. Now, on the one hand, I know it's sort of jacked up because it's almost like Munchausen syndrome by proxy, right? Where you make yourself sick first, and then you rush to the hospital to prove what a great hero you are. So in a way, we've like screwed up the society, and then we rush in to fix it. So I know it's like really sort of weird. But the point is, we can fix it if we choose. You know, we can make certain decisions that are solidaristic and empathic and rooted in a notion of collective liberation from oppression. If that is the one thing that makes us truly different from all these other species, then who are we not to do the one thing that makes us different? Who are we to sort of eschew that role and to ignore that and do anything else without at least doing that in part? And so then what it becomes is it's not about whether you win or lose, even though we all want, those of us who fight for justice, we want to see justice. But it's about planting seeds that others are going to have to water, and that it's going to, if it comes at all, it's going to come long after you're gone. It's taken a lot of time to screw things up. It's going to take a lot of times to undo that damage. We're not probably going to see it, but we have the opportunity to be a part of it. And once we get clear on that, and once we stop this sort of cultural obsession we have with victory and with outcomes, and not to say that outcome isn't important, but it just is a long-term thing. It's not a sprint, it's this marathon thing. And once we let go of it, and we just stay focused on trying to, I don't know, James Baldwin had this great way of saying it. He said that we have to earn our death, right? And what he meant, and he said, one has to earn one's death by confronting the conundrum of life. And the conundrum of life, right, is this notion that we're all hurtling toward our own mortality, and that's just the truth. And we try to run from it, and we try to flee from it, and we try to wrap ourselves, as Baldwin said, in all kinds of totems and crosses and taboos and synagogues and mosques and temples and armies and nations and flags. And we do all that as a way to run from death, when death is, as he said, the only fact we have. And so if that is the only fact we have, one has to earn one's death by the way one lives one's life. You have to earn the right to check out of this place, because we've been given this incredible capacity to either do right or do wrong by one another. And so often we choose the latter, but every now and then we get it right. And to me, and not only as I look at my children and I know that I have the motivation vis-a-vis them to make things better, but just vis-a-vis all of you and the people who I meet and have met over the years, I know that we can do better, and I know that at the very least we have to try. And it may seem trite, and it may seem obvious, and it may seem incredibly basic, but I think that we've lost sight of that. And so sometimes we decide, because we live in this, very solution-oriented society, so like if you have a headache, you take a pill, right? And if you weigh a little too much, you get liposuction. And if you whatever it is, you got an instant quick fix for that. They got pills for everything. They'll be happy to sell you late at night on infomercials, right? And so there's always a solution for every malady. But this is bigger than that, This is not something that we've got quick fixes for. And I think we've become sort of inured to that longer-term struggle, because we're such a rich society relative to the history of the world and most other societies, that we really do think, like, if there's a solution, it ought to come by next week. And if it doesn't come by next week, maybe there isn't a solution. Right? And we forget this long arc of struggle that people have been engaged in for a very long time. So that's just a really long way of saying that leading by example and being committed to it in oneself and others is the only chance that we have. And there's a very good chance that even if we do the work, it will not save us. I mean, there is a very good chance, a better than average chance, that there isn't anything we're going to be able to do to save ourselves from literally destroying life on the planet. That's a real possibility, ecologically and otherwise. It is a real possibility. So I do not know, and I'm not saying that to be like a real downer, I'm just saying that's what the evidence says, right? So we are reaching that point where virtually all the large fish in the oceans are already dead. That's where we are right now. I mean, this is not like speculative. This is happening. Mass ecological catastrophes happening, and we've done that. That isn't sunspots. That isn't whatever Fox News says it is. That is human involvement. And so we'll either fix that or we won't. But I know that there's no way that that stops just because the clock turns and the calendar pages flip. It only stops if we seek to make it stop. And all of our efforts may prove to be for nothing, but if we don't make the effort, we know exactly what the outcome will be. And so given the choice between the guarantee of defeat and destruction and the possibility of justice and survival, I know which of those I'm going to come down in favor of. All right. Thank you all so much.